I really don't mind being one of about 10 people who loved LA Noire, Team Bondi's ode to films like Chinatown and LA Confidential, both of which painted a pulpy and romanticized portrait of detectives working the seedy underbelly of post-World War II Los Angeles. The game's claim to fame was its use of motion scan, a technology that digitally inserted the filmed faces of its actors in order for the player to examine their various facial tics and expressions to determine whether suspects were telling the truth. Despite being ahead of its time, LA Noire became synonymous with criticisms levied against its overworked staff, and after its release from a long and troubled production, the studio was shut down. And that sucks. Replaying the game again for a review felt like it gave me a second chance to really appreciate the work of the former studio's talented staff. After its console release in 2011, LA Noire made its way to PC, and as an added extra, HTC Vive owners got a series of VR-enhanced recreations of cases from the game. Instead of a gamepad or mouse and keyboard, they could use the more immersive control devices and reap the benefits of a really well-made virtual reality headset. I was extremely jealous at the time because I was in no position to own a Vive, much less a PC that could actually run the damn thing. And after the PlayStation VR was released to the market, I'd always hoped that the VR cases would come my way. And now that it's a thing, the result is a textbook case of be careful what you wish for. LA Noire, the VR cases, is finally accessible to me, and now I kinda wish it wasn't.
Hey, Cole. You got here quick.
My beat crosses 7th Street.
Okay. You're first reporting then. We'll get a perimeter going and move the crowd on. You better see what you can find out before the homicide dicks show up. I'll be with you in a moment.
The VR Cases is a whistle-stop tour of the full game, breaking up the story of Cole Phelps and his meteoric rise as a detective in the Los Angeles Police Department into standalone chunks. This time, played from the first-person perspective, all of the elements that defined LA Noire's gameplay, rummaging around crime scenes, examining dead bodies, questioning suspects, and getting into the occasional fist and gunfights, have been preserved with the exception of enhanced controls tied to the PlayStation Move wands. Even though Rockstar deserves a lot of credit for really thinking through connecting the game's mechanics to the Move's unique control design, the result is hardly an ideal recreation of the smoothness afforded to a gamepad. The Move makes things like examining bodies and picking up items feel clunky and uncomfortable in ways I could never get used to. Not only that, it was too easy to behave in a way that puts the wands outside of the PlayStation camera's field of view. Gun combat in particular feels clumsy and unreliable. Furthermore, the inherent jitteriness of the Move, something I've gotten used to over the years, makes it tricky to perform some of the game's more precise actions, like choosing questions and presenting evidence as listed in Cole's notebook, or aiming at a perp with your service pistol. About the only part of the game where the Move wands were actually pretty great is when you're driving around town. These are the most intuitive controls because braking, reversing, and acceleration are mapped to the trigger buttons. Driving feels pretty good and not overly sensitive, which means you won't be frantically turning the wheel left and right to compensate for twitchy, quick-turning vehicles. The VR version of LA Noire also trims a lot of extra actions that make for a disjointed, disconnected feel. Of the 3 possible control schemes, Rockstar has made it possible for people of varying VR sensitivity to experience the game. This does have a net negative impact because the concessions made to accommodate everyone proved to be a distraction I couldn't cope with. Many of these are movement transitions, fading to black moments before climbing a set of stairs, hiking over a short wall, or walking up to an interactive object. Other activities, such as checking for wounds on various body parts, has been taken away, making Phelps look like some hyper-aware savant instead of him catching details while examining a corpse. You'll find a lot of cut corners here, one of which happens to be the total removal of the chase sequence in the buyer beware case, which makes the final confrontation feel truncated and awkward. Another problem I was dissatisfied with is the issues with staging the game's actors during cutscenes. It's wholly inconsistent, using a first-person view for one scene, then shifting to a third person for another. Sometimes it works fine, but then you get awkward moments when you see the characters aren't even looking at you as they speak. The third act of Buyer Beware introduces Cole to the LAPD's Irish police officer caricature James Donnelly, who gives a grand speech about conducting interrogations. In the original game, the camera is set tight in front of the 2 men and ends with a shot of Donnelly pointing to Cole and delivering a dramatic line. For the VR case files, I laughed as I watched Donnelly play out the scene the same way, only half the time he walked out of view and spoke to me with his back turned, his finger of righteousness pointing off in the direction of empty space.
A motive, opportunity, hard evidence, and best of all, a confession. If you fail in the former, you can always use a modicum of violence to obtain the latter. How are you feeling, lad?
Fine, sir.
Very good. The evidence is overwhelming. May the cat eat him and the cat be eaten by the devil. Bring me a confession, young Phelps. This is your chance. Don't fail me.
There are many situations like this, and it really bugged the hell out of me. Like when Donnelly, again, doesn't even look at me during the briefing for the silk stocking murder despite sitting next to him. The original game used camera angles for a dramatic reason, and without them, scenes come across as goofy and wrong. My ire might sound unreasonable. After all, to make these scenes work in VR, Rockstar would have to go back and restage them. But other scenes use a third-person camera anyway, so why not just stick with it? I wouldn't fault the game for doing so, but in its current state, it seems like just another lazy cut corner.
What exactly did you see?
So the one thing the VR Case Files has going for it against the original game is the unintended hilarity that comes from having full control over Cole's arms. Antithetical to the overall seriousness and tone is the complete freedom you have to goof around, lifting up evidence and other interactive bits and casually throwing them around or at people. One of the movement options involves swaying the move wands to mimic the way your arms move when you walk, which feels silly and unnatural. When interviewing people, the pencil that was originally designed as a cursor now can move freely, and you can draw with it. Making crude doodles in the notebook while the traumatized victim of a crime openly weeps offers a whole new spin on the character of Cole Phelps, turning him from a compassionate, if flawed detective to an inconsiderate asshole. And it's funny as hell. So too is the hand-to-hand combat. I don't know who on the development team made it an option to slap people, but good lord, I thank them for it. Getting into fisticuffs with a perp is decent, blocking their swings and landing punches when they create an opening, but slapping them is ridiculous enough to be awesome. With only a smattering of the game's cases available in VR, Rockstar padded out the length by including a shooting gallery that lets you try out all sorts of weapons in a controlled environment, and more bizarrely, a boxing tournament involving all of the game's cast who spew one-liners that outright spoil major parts of the story. I wasn't thrilled with the shooting gallery mostly because of the aforementioned jittery move wands that make precision aiming a pointless endeavor. The races were the only thing that I remotely liked because driving in VR actually handles pretty well.
Son of a bitch wants her identified.
Just because you have the technology to do something doesn't mean you actually should. The cold hard fact is that I love LA Noire far too much to accept the odd quirks created as a result of a forced first-person camera, confined play areas, and frequent truncation of the investigations. I waited a long time to try out the VR version of my favorite game, and I'm dumbstruck by how pointless it is. The VR Case Files, though technically well adapted to the platform, is a novelty, a carnival rendition of a game I hold a huge amount of personal respect for. If nothing else, I thank LA Noire the VR Case Files for reaffirming my love and respect for the original game. DarkStation gives LA Noire the VR Case Files for the PlayStation VR 3 stars.